Hey everyone, Rob B here with Rob D, and you are listening to the Property Podcast. Now this is part 2 of a 2-part episode. Last week we looked at inflation and deflation and how it massively impacts you as a property investor. Well, as it impacts you so much, this week we're going to look at what's going to happen in the future. With so much at stake and so many opinions out there, we're brave enough to share a few of our own.
Welcome to the Property Podcast, where every Thursday morning property investors come to be informed and inspired. In this week's episode, yes, we are going to be giving you our view on whether we think inflation or deflation is more likely to play out. But more important than that, we're going to be giving you the reasons why so you can come to your own judgment. And make sure you stick around to the end for Hub Extra, because we've got even more resources to share to boost your understanding of this critical area.
So we have a couple of news stories for you this week, and the first one comes from The Times. And you would think with it being in The Times and it being about Barclays, a big bank, and buy-to-let lending, that this is a huge story. The headline reads, "Tougher rules for buy-to-let landlords." And it goes on to say that Barclays is to stop giving mortgages to buy-to-let landlords who buy properties through their limited companies. From there, it goes on to talk about other tighter measures. Now, this is quite strange because it goes against the current momentum of most other lenders coming back to the market, opening up their products again. And with it being Barclays, this is a headline that could probably spook some buy-to-let investors. So that's why we want to talk about it. Because the news to me was that Barclays were even lending in the first place. I didn't know. And it's not that I don't have my finger on the pulse. Because of what we do at Property Hub Invest, I see hundreds and hundreds of mortgages go through. And I've never seen Barclays lend via a limited company. I didn't even know they were in the market. And it turns out they only lend at 65% loan to value at interest only. And that's probably why. So it's a big news story, a big splash, but I can't imagine they did much lending in the first place with the products they had out. And I'm not sure why it's got the headlines with them retreating from the market, other than to say it's a big brand. So it's a news story that's really a non-news story, but we've highlighted it in case you've read it, panicked a bit and thought, oh, things are looking pretty bad. Actually, nothing's really happened. So hopefully, Rob, in the next news story, something else happened.
Yeah, we have got something that's happened, although it's happened in the courts and it's happened in quite a confusing way. So I'll try to summarise it a little bit. So this is a story from Landlord Today that's titled "Court of Appeal Sides with Landlords in Landmark Case Ruling." What this is, basically, is to serve a Section 21 notice. So to end a tenancy without your tenants having done anything wrong, you need to meet certain conditions. And one of those conditions is having given the tenants a gas safety certificate. And there was a previous ruling that suggested that if you didn't issue a gas safety certificate before the tenants moved in, you could never use a Section 21 to evict those tenants. Even if the gas safety certificate did exist, you just forgot to give it to them and you then gave it to them later. So basically, you make a mistake once and there's nothing you can do to put it right. You can never rely on Section 21. What this Court of Appeal case has done is basically clarify that you can make up for it later. In other words, as long as before you serve the eviction notice, you do issue the certificate, you're all good. So that is good news. There are still some situations around gas certs that are unclear. The nature of the way that the legal system works is you just get precedent coming out of specific cases. So if there was an element that wasn't addressed in a particular case, you have to wait for another case to come along that does have that element before you actually get a ruling on it. So this doesn't 100% clarify everything, but definitely removes one risk and something that some landlords have been very worried about. Before we can get to our main topic this week, we just need to pop in from the future with an emergency hot off the press update, because we recorded Inflation and Deflation Part 1, which you heard last week, and Part 2, which you'll hear in just a minute, both at the same time. Since we recorded those, a new news story has come out from the Bank of England about QE, which is something that we talk about during these episodes. In these episodes, we talk about how more QE, more money printing, has already happened this year than happened in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crash. And we said that we were certain that this was just the start, that there would be more. Well, we didn't have to wait long, because already, before the episode could even air, a news story has come out saying the Bank of England will pump an extra 100 billion into the UK economy to help fight the unprecedented coronavirus-induced downturn.
That's right. We'd already highlighted that the amount of QE was bigger than the total that was put in during the financial crisis. And that's just extended even further. So the importance of this episode is increased even more so. Do make sure you've listened to last week's episode, and do make sure that you really take this week's in. You may want to have a couple of goes through to help it sink in, but there's a lot happening here, and you need to understand as property investors what this means, because it's going to impact you. Interestingly as well, and very much related to the topic, inflation has been slowing down as you would expect at the moment, because oil prices, for example, have collapsed. So inflation is still in the positive. It's still 0.5% in May, and that's down from 0.8% in April. You'd expect it to fall a bit further in the short term, but what happens next? Well, that's coming up in the episode.
Are we heading for inflation or deflation? We've already seen that inflation can be great for property investors and deflation can be damaging. So you need to know which one we're likely to be headed for. Well, that is exactly what we're going to talk you through in this episode. But before we get into that, let's have a quick recap of the ground we covered last week.
So last week on the Property Podcast, we looked at what inflation is, what deflation is, what causes both, and most importantly, how they impact you as a property investor. And we learned that inflation is an incredibly powerful tool for property investors if you understand how it impacts you. And deflation, understandably, is something that many investors and economists and world leaders fear. Now, with so much happening in the global economy right now, there is a chance for us to swing wildly into a deflationary period or high inflation, or a high inflationary period as well. And neither of them really are attractive. And while some inflation is good, very high inflation can also be seen to be negative because things are just getting out of control. So there's a lot at stake here. If you can accept that deflation isn't desirable, high inflation isn't desirable, and some mild inflation is what works for most parties, then you've got a fine balancing act to play here. And this week in the podcast, we're going to look at that balancing act and be bold enough to predict, or at least suggest, what we think may play out in the future.
Now, last week we talked about various deflationary forces like unemployment and improvements in technology and low commodity prices and a renewed shift in psychology towards saving and not spending. And we're seeing all of those right now. So on the face of it, there's a strong argument that we're heading for deflationary times, and there are lots of people who are arguing that. However, we also said that the biggest factor at play is QE, effectively money printing. It's dressed up with long words and a complicated mechanism. The government has borrowed money, yes, a lot of it. They borrowed more in May 2020 than they borrowed in the whole of the previous year. But that's not all they've done. They've also created a lot of money out of thin air. And that, as we explained before, is highly inflationary. So those are the two sides of the argument. You have some people who look at the deflationary forces and say that they're so strong and say that they're going to dominate in the coming years. You've got others who look at the money printing, the QE, and say that that is strong enough to override everything else and be inflationary. And my kind of default view is falling into the latter camp. Printing more money and sticking it into the economy is so inflationary and it's happening at such a scale that it seems that that should bring about inflation. That force should win out. However, there's something complicating this argument, which is this is not the first time we've seen QE. We had it before. We had it in the aftermath of 2008. And people were saying at the time, oh my goodness, all this money is being created. This is going to produce really high inflation. And yet it didn't. Why?
First of all, after the last crash, banks were told that they had to hold more money than before. So because banks were holding more in reserve, that was a deflationary force. So more money was put into the system via QE, but then banks were holding more money back because they were told to, creating a deflationary pressure. So that helped minimise the amount of inflation that occurred. Also, money was being destroyed at the same time. No, it wasn't being set on fire, but defaults were high. People were not paying back those debts. So if the money isn't paid back, then again, that's deflationary. So again, pulling back on the powerful QE force. And finally, another major reason for QE having some inflationary effect, but not a huge one, is that the newly printed money went into assets. So asset prices inflated, but not the consumer inflation. So the way QE was distributed meant that it went into bonds. Bond prices then fell, and then it forced investors to look to other assets to invest in, like property. So QE helped push up property prices, but it didn't push up the prices of a washing machine, your milk, or a TV. So it was selective inflation. So left to its own devices, QE is a very powerful force and could potentially, if overused, cause huge inflation. But because there was enough pulling back on QE, it prevented high inflation. Now, was that masterful economic play by our world leaders and the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve? Maybe. Was it luck? Maybe. But will they get it right again? Could this time be different?
It could be different this time because the circumstances surrounding it are different. And let's look at some of those. First of all, there's the raw amount of money being created. In the aftermath of the last financial crisis, there was QE of about £575 billion. There were some in 2009, there was some more in 2012. Totaled, it made £575 billion. In March of 2020, just March 2020, no other time, QE of £645 billion took place. So in a single month, there was more QE than was used to try to get things back on track after the great financial crash. And is that going to be the end of QE? It seems highly unlikely to me. I think it's more likely that that's just the beginning. So even if nothing else, the scale of QE is bigger. And it certainly seems naive to think that you can just pump infinitely more and more money into the economy without it being inflationary. You've also got the fact that money isn't being destroyed at the same time. So like Rob said, after the last crash, you had loans that were being written off and not repaid at all. You also had loans that were being repaid, which actually decreases the amount of money in the system. It's hard to understand without getting into fractional reserve banking, but effectively people repaying loans destroys money. So that was a force that offset the creation of new money. That's not happening this time. At the moment, banks are still lending. Banks are in a much stronger position this time. So rather than the banks being given newly created money and then just hanging on to it, they're more likely to lend it out. Every time they lend it out, they're multiplying that new money. So that 645 billion we've already seen could end up being a whole lot more. Then there's the matter of where that money goes. Again, like Rob said, the way that that money was created and distributed last time, it ended up going into assets. So the majority of the money that was created never actually went anywhere near what you'd call the real economy, as in everyday people earning money and spending it on goods and services. It just went straight into asset prices. So you did have asset price inflation, but you didn't have consumer inflation. This time, there's still some of that going on, but there are different mechanisms at play as well. More of the money that's being created is going into the real economy. In other words, it's going to end up in the pockets of people like you and me. Now, the mechanism by which it happens is complicated and it's a bit different in the US from the UK, but essentially we're seeing loans to businesses that we weren't seeing before. Businesses are being loaned huge sums of money to keep them afloat. The government is directly paying people's wages in the form of the furlough scheme. So that's money going into individuals' pockets that otherwise wouldn't have been. In the US, they're even making direct payments to households. So they're literally creating money, writing checks and sending it to people in the hope that they'll spend it. So this is very different from last time. Before, the new money ended up sitting in banks and going into assets. This time, that's still happening, but more of it is ending up with individuals. So that doesn't mean it's inevitably going to be inflationary, but it does mean that just because QE didn't produce high inflation last time, you can't say that it's not going to this time.
So to geeks like us, this is fascinating. But what does it all mean? What's the outcome of all this? Well, initially, there will be a lack of inflation because of lower demand. The world is struggling economically right now. So therefore, there are a lot of deflationary pressures in place. And a lot of this money that has been pumped into the system hasn't begun to work its way through yet. But it will. So prediction one is that deflation, for all its forces at play, will probably not take place. Inflation will be the way forward. But there's a risk here of massive inflation, much higher than the levels that we're used to. And if inflation does get out of control, interest rates will rise to try and control it, which then makes debt harder to service and may be a trigger for the future crash. Now, we're talking years and years away. And what we believe will most likely happen before then is that all this money into the system will create a boom, but it'll be too much money. The boom will be huge, but then interest rates will start to rise, and at some point it'll be the trigger for everything to come tumbling down again. And that marries up against the 18-year property cycle quite nicely, something that we talked about a few weeks ago. And like we've said over the last few weeks and months, please do come up with your own thoughts and theories. We may have an unconscious bias here that we want the 18-year property cycle to work. I don't believe that's true. It just seems incredible how everything's mapping out that way. But I think the most important thing from this over the last 2 weeks is you understanding what's happening, not just accepting what's happening. Because you can accept that, oh wow, we've got inflation, and oh wow, I've heard about some QE. But most people don't understand why it's happening and also what the consequences of these actions. But because you've listened to the last 2 weeks of the podcast, you now do. And that puts you in a really powerful position. Because if you understand the mechanics of what's playing out, if other announcements and measures are introduced or made, then you can start to put together your own case, your own picture for what may be the consequences of that action. So if there is more QE, what does that mean? If QE is withdrawn and they try to unwind it really quickly, what does that mean? You understand now. You've got the base knowledge now to understand the impact of these things, and that should give you huge reassurance as a property investor, because you are at an advantage now, because most people, unfortunately, don't understand this.
This is it. It's so important that you're able to come to your own judgment about this, and it is only ever going to be a judgment. We can give our opinion, but we don't know. No one knows. We've talked about some of the different forces at play, but that's just scratching the surface. There's so much going on. It's impossible for anyone, including the people in charge of the printing presses, to say what's going to happen. There are extremely well-respected economists making very strong arguments for deflation. There are equally respected economists making very strong arguments for inflation. So clearly this isn't cut and dry. Therefore, it's important that you do listen to both sides and come to your own view of which is most likely to happen, and then incorporate any new information that happens into the future into the framework that you've built. Because you could so easily be led astray. You could happen to listen to one very convincing person talking about why there's bound to be deflation for the next decade. And if you believed that, then you wouldn't invest in property, because all the forces that make inflation useful for property investors will be working against you. And that could be the right thing to do, but it could also be completely the wrong thing to do. You could miss out on creating vast amounts of wealth because you've only listened to one side of the argument and you didn't have the tools to come to your own more balanced view about what's likely. But now you do. These have been a very dense couple of episodes. You might want to go back and listen to parts again.
So if you've gotten this far through part 1 and part 2, well done. This is a big topic and there's a lot to go through and understand here. You might want to go through and listen again if it's not all sunk in yet. But the main thing is, if you have persisted and you've got this far and you've listened to this much, we've got high hopes for you. Most people just don't care enough to understand what's happening around them. But you do. And that honestly sets you apart from most other property investors. So while these topics can be big, scary, and sometimes a little intimidating, the fact that you are taking the time to build on your knowledge puts you in such a strong position. Congratulations.
Time now for Hub Extra, that part of the show before we finish where we like to give you that little bit more. And is backed up with a Hub Extra email that hits the inboxes of Property Hub members every Friday morning. This week, not just one resource, but several, because in the course of putting this pair of episodes together, we've done a lot of reading and watching and listening to help us understand this ourselves and come to a view about what we think is likely to happen in the future. And maybe what we've given you is enough. For many people, it will be. But if you do want to go a little bit deeper and understand this in even more detail, we're sharing some of the resources that we've been using. So in there is a short video from the Bank of England about quantitative easing. If you're not confident about how all that works, that video will make it a lot clearer. There's also a couple of podcast episodes from other people that we listen to, and an extremely long article that looks highly intimidating, but actually does a brilliant job of setting out quite simply much of what we've talked about, and it comes at it from a US perspective as well. So lots there for you to get your teeth into if you're so inclined, and you'll find links to all of that in this week's show notes.
So we've given you plenty to be occupied with, but if that isn't enough, then you can check out all our social channels at Property Hub UK. You'll find us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and of course there's the YouTube channel as well. Loads to sink your teeth into. And of course we'll be back next week with Ask Rob and Rob and the Property Podcast. So until then, take care everyone. Have fun. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.